Welcome students. In this video lecture I will be talking about the history of American history, that is the historical context to the poem Harlem, or the historical context to the time and the place when Langston Hughes came to be writing. So we will be talking about the various uh, historical incidents and events that shaped the time and the culture to which Hughes belonged, and in which Hughes created his niche. Hughes created his niche for poetry or jazz poetry. So the 20th century, so here we are talking about the 20th century America. The 20th century begins with a few forces, with new forces emerging not just in America, but around the world, and the concern with events beyond the nation's borders. All of that determines the idea of America, the idea that is America, even as it influences the thematic focus and forms of its literature. So both are happening together. The idea of new America and the new American literature that would characterize American literature, Americanness, all of that came to be simultaneously. Technological advances, great economic changes, the influences of European art movements, the world wars, the depression, and its end with the Second World War are now the conditions for the production of literature. So the production of literature will be influenced by all of these things. These are also the years of literary and cultural modernism, a movement that emerges out of the huge and turbulent forces of economic change and development, of social upheaval, class mobilities of people and ideas, interrogations of the self and its relationship to the world, of problems of representation and innovations in form. So what we are seeing, how they are to be represented, our perceptions that form our ideas of the ways that we see other people, other things, the things around us, the world around us. All of these ideas, they are developing, they are innovating themselves together with technology, together with industry, together with culture, class, and history. The major historical events that influenced social and economic conditions and the environment include the two world wars and the depression. So we are not only going to talk about the literature of the time, but also how the historical changes, the events that happened during the time, they shaped the literature of the time. So let us first begin with the First World War, or World War I. The impact of the First World War in America was manifold. Initially, it seemed unnecessary, as America had no direct quarrel with any of the countries involved in this conflict. And however, as often it is in the case of wars, America's entry could be traced to a very minor incident that happened in 1915. So what happened in 1915? In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, and among the 1,200 passengers drowned were 128 Americans. This was an instance of German U-boat or submarine warfare that was directed at British shipping, and that by January 1917 developed into full-scale attacks on naval and passenger ships. The president was Woodrow Wilson at that point of time. President Woodrow Wilson still held back because there were no direct attacks on American citizens or property. But in February and March of the same year, German U-boats or submarines sank a number of American ships. the US Congress sanctioned America's entry into the war on 6th April 1917. Wilson is considered to be one of the most astute American presidents, conducted the US war effort with a combination of propaganda, which involved talks, discussions, distribution of pamphlets, the banning of German music, the language teaching, and the renaming of the hamburger as the Liberty Sandwich. So the hamburger, which was something that that came to be because of a small town in Germany called Hamburg, where soldiers, they discovered kind of innovated shredded beef sandwich, and that came to be known as hamburger. So Woodrow Wilson renamed that burger or sandwich and called it the Liberty Sandwich. And that is what propaganda is for you. That is the bending of ideas, bending of ideologies in accordance to the advantages of people who are in power, in accordance to the advantages of people who want to maintain power. So Woodrow Wilson, he combined propaganda, all of these things, and organization of finance for the war through the War Finance Corporation, which coordinated the collection of taxes from people to provide the financial backing needed in the venture, especially through the Liberty Loan Act of 1917. The Liberty Loan Act of 1917, which allowed citizens to purchase bonds, government bonds, that is. There was curtailing, that is, snipping off of certain liberties of the citizens, of civilians. There was the introduction of the draft, which involved compulsory war service. So you were to be drafted. The compulsory war service through which troops and other military personnel were supplied to the armed forces. So what were these acts? They were the Selective Service Acts, Selective Service Acts of 1917, which made it illegal to resist the draft. So you cannot say that, no, I do not want to participate in the war, I do not want to be drafted. That was illegal. And there was the Espionage Act, again in 1917, and the Sedition Act. So the names, they speak for themselves, of 1918. These dealt severely with dissenters or people who disagreed to the national propaganda and those who were suspected of aiding the enemy. And the final aspect of Wilson's strategy was the actual US participation in the war, with a large force that played a decisive role during the war. The US casualties on the Western Front were put at 1,12,432, according to certain historians. Next, we talk about the Prohibition. I believe that I have spoken somewhat about this with reference to the popularity of the jazz clubs that were coming up during the time. So other aspects of life continued. This is a really interesting development, as we can see how the banning of alcohol and liquor from the lives of people, it led them or directed them towards a different way of life, towards a different channel of being happy without the liquor. So other aspects of life continued without too much interruption, since the war was conducted outside US territory. Internal concerns still figured large, finding expression in different kinds of coercive acts and legislation. The reform impulse has already been strong in America. So there was an acute energy among the administrative power holders that there ought to be certain reform in America. The American culture needed to be gleaned out from the remnants of the British culture. So that was already there. The spirit of reform was already there. From around the end of 18th century, it began to appear that society needed reform from various evils which were settling down upon it, including an excessive devotion to alcohol, to drink, that is. The 19th century saw these impulses, and the next century, that is, saw these impulses peaking in the cluster of concerns over temperance, so as I was saying, the 19th century, the next century, that is, saw these impulses peaking, gaining height and gaining momentum in a cluster of concerns over what? Concerns over temperance, moral reform, by which was meant against, the fight against prostitution and illicit or illegal sex, that is, anti-Catholicism, anti-slavery, and labor reform. So these were the concerns because of which it was thought that alcohol ought to be banned, and all of these things could then fall into place. So it was thought that it was because that people were inclined to drinking a lot, or the culture of alcohol was growing a lot. That was the terms, that was the phrases that were being used. Those were the phrases being used. So it was thought that it was the consumption of alcohol which gave rise to a temperance, a kind of temperance or a kind of sensitivity which went against the ideology of power, which went against the ideology of America. Moral reform, anti-Catholicism was caused because of the consumption of alcohol. Anti-slavery sentiments was caused because of consumption of alcohol. All of these things were the concerns due to which alcohol was the culprit. Alcohol was thought to be the culprit, and this is something that's something that is mentioned in the book called Beneath the American Renaissance, whatever you want to call it, the subversive imagination of in the age of Emerson, that is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Melville, that is Herman Melville, writers and reformers. This book came out in 1988, and it was written by David S. Reynolds. So Reynolds writes that impulses towards taking a drink peaked because of the concerns over these things. Each one of these areas of concern had larger implications in society, politics, and the economy. The issue of alcohol abuse brought together all these other concerns, since each of these areas were affected in some way by it. Prohibition and the many accompanying negative connotations of alcoholism came to be linked to a deep and almost fanatic obsession with sin and degradation. So consumption of alcohol eventually led to, became simultaneous or became corresponding to the committing of sin. And degradation that led to abortion, that led to prostitution, production and distribution of obscene literature. So all of these causes, they referred, all of these effects, they made alcohol the cause. It is very much like, when I think it was 4 to 5 years ago that UP was supposed to ban, Akhilesh Yadav was supposed to ban liquor in Bihar because of rise of domestic abuse and hooliganism. So that was one of the way in which the government thought that these ills of the society could be curbed, rather than advocating awareness, rather than advocating logic and rationality behind describing why these acts are bad in itself, and not the consumption of alcohol itself that should be banned, because you cannot change the ideology or the conceptual nature of man, who thinks that it is okay to exert superiority over somebody who is weak. So we can put this equation in a lot of scenarios. We can use this equation in gender scenario, we can use this equation in social classes scenario, in the caste scenario, in the religious reform scenario. So we can obviously direct ourselves or direct our minds that there is a substance that is causing all of these things, or there is a substance that is influencing all of these things, or increasing the degree of crime in a society. But there are obviously much more tangible factors and proven factors that could be curbed, that could be attended to, and which would yield better results than the prohibition of alcohol. So throughout the 19th century, several states had passed legislations against alcohol. Many social ills were attributed to alcohol abuse, and women were among the foremost crusaders against it. Women were among the foremost crusaders against it. Just let me extend this board. Yes. The Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in 1874. Prohibition was given constitutional sanction. The Constitution sanctioned prohibition with the 18th Amendment in 1920. This was the culmination of an almost fanatic, upheaval against alcohol and its ill effects that raged through the 19th century, and that was given occasional official support through legislations like various laws that supported the abolition of alcohol, such as Comstock Law, the Maine Law, the Volstead Act, and the last culminating in the amendment of the Constitution, therefore sanctioning prohibition for finality, that is. The effects of the drink on individuals and families and society found ample representation directly and indirectly in the writings of the period. One of the most representative texts about the effects of alcohol, a direct response to it in writing, was John Barleycorn. Barleycorn, we can understand, is that the ingredients with which most of the alcoholic beverages are made. So this came out in 1913, written by Jack London. It is an autobiographical account of the writer's own addiction to alcohol. Some of London's tales have protagonists who are hard drinkers, while drink as a problem again appeared in Maggie, a girl off the streets. This came out in, this is earlier work, 1893. This was by Stephen Crane. There were other books, other works, such as The Jungle, which came out in 1906. It was written by Upton Sinclair. So Upton Sinclair, in The Jungle, which is the novel which is based on the meat packing industry, he portrays his protagonist Jurgis Rudkas, who is a Lithuanian immigrant, as a man who can only face the daily horrors of workplace under the numbing effects of alcohol. In fact, the immigrant, in the poor work environment of the factories and the congested tenements in which he or she lived, was often accused of being the source of all the evils that stemmed from drink, and this was frequently true. The hard-drinking Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, was a hard drinker. He clearly owes something to these times. Maybe he was inspired a lot by these times, as he took the philosophy of the time as his lifestyle. So it is a very common scenario amongst us as well, and it is very easy to blame certain lower sections of the society to be engaged too much with hooch or local liquor, that is, it is very easy to blame them for the malcontent that we see around us. It is very easy to make them the malcontent, to criminalize them, that is, a rickshaw puller, for example, who always reeks of hooch or local liquor. It's very easy to blame him. But we must endeavor also, at the same time, we must endeavor to seek out the psychological reason behind his daily consumption of alcohol, even though he clearly cannot afford it. Even though it is logical, we might think logically that the amount he earns from pulling the rickshaw, that must be more useful in his home rather than paying for alcohol, that is. But it is often true. The truth that we must take with a pinch of salt is that illiteracy and lack of proper living conditions, owing to lack of proper job prospects, frustration, anxiety, stress, and the inability to provide for something that masculinity is burdened with, even till now in our society, that a man has to provide for the family. That is one of the biggest reasons that women were also formed the forefront in their attacks against alcohol, in the society's attacks against alcohol. As you can see, the WCTU, which was formed, the Women's Association, which was formed as frontline workers that supported prohibition. So the men who were burdened with the responsibility of providing for the family, yet being incapable of doing so, due to lack of job prospects, or even if they have the job, it is not paying them sufficiently to feed their family members, coupled with illiteracy, coupled with unhygienic living conditions, coupled with all of the anxiety and stress that being a human being of flesh and bones, of someone who needs food in order to live, it brings being a human being will bring all of these emotions inside of you. Until and unless you belong to privilege, you are privileged, you will face with all of these anxieties, you will be faced with all of these stress and with all of these predicaments and dilemmas over choices. And alcohol is oftentimes, sex and alcohol oftentimes forms the perfect partners, and which results in proliferated domestic abuse, which results in increased pregnancy rates among the illiterates, among the poorer sections of the society. So there are a lot of psychological aspects that we need to take into concern before criminalizing them. It is the existential world in which we live in. We are more often than not in control of the environment in which we are thrust into, of the society in which we have to make a living for. It is more often than not difficult for many people. Even how much ever honestly they try, how much ever they try to be, the society sometimes does not allow them to move in a direction that they would really love to. And being stuck in the same vicious cycle of poverty for years, for generations probably, it makes you inclined towards embracing your natural animalistic instincts, which is oftentimes triggered by consumption of alcohol. So in the backdrop to the prohibition was the invention of that one thing that we are supposed to love very much, even though I personally do not. Just a moment. So in the backdrop of all of these to the prohibition and all of these that was happening, those were happening, that is, was the invention of cola. This alternative to alcohol began as a humble soda water, which was dispensed across the counter and from drugstore soda fountains in the first few decades of the 19th century. And we still see advertisements of alcoholic beverages as soda water. All right, so this is where it comes from. Looking for an improvement, an Atlanta druggist named John Stith Pemberton blended cola leaf extract with cola nut juice and came up with a drink that was soothing and not so sweet. He called it the CocaCola. This was in the 1880s. He went on to tell his invention to Asa Chandler Briggs in 1887. And when it again changed hands in 1919, the company was worth $25 million already. By 1905, Coke, I am quoting this, Coke was being advertised throughout America as the national temperance drink. So it became, see how the ideology behind it works. So you prohibit one thing and you bring in a substitution of that. So capitalism will never let go of an opportunity to gain money or to rob you of the money which you might have saved, since you are not spending so much of alcohol. So if that was the condition, if people were spending so much, people were inclined towards the drink so much, so it is a logical conclusion that they were spending so much. And now that it is banned, there is less spending. So capitalism brings in another product which will again pull you into that cycle of consumerism. So Coke was being advertised as the national temperance drink, one of the concerns due to which alcohol was banned, that is the bad temperance, the impulsiveness. Pepsi, the rival drink, was invented by another druggist, Caleb D. Bradham, in the 1890s, marketed by inspired salesmen who positioned their products with an almost religious fervor. The consumption of the soft drinks acquired a nationalistic significance, becoming part of idea of America. Coca-Cola and America, they became a superimposed image, and during the Second World War, iced Coke was made available to all American soldiers as a substitute for alcohol, with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the commander of the American forces in Europe, ensuring through 10 bottling plants across the area of his command that his soldiers were never without Coke. That is the propaganda, that was the propaganda behind it. The cola story also brought forth its literary representations as well, and it brought forth the profession of the salesman. One of the most important works in American literature, The Death of a Salesman. You can go ahead and give it a read. It was written in 1949 by Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller used to be Marilyn Monroe's husband, by the way. So Arthur Miller, and in it we have the character of Willie Loman, the everyman hero, quote unquote, or the common man hero, that is, as Miller named this type in his essay called Tragedy and the Common Man. He is unsuccessful at the profession of salesman, but Miller uses the romance behind the idea of the traveling salesman to project a typically American modernist consciousness in the bleak ambience of the play. So the conditions which are not improving but giving birth to this man who becomes typical of the age, that is quite antithetical if you think deeply about it. He is unsuccessful, yet it is the passion and not the passion but the romance, the idea behind the traveling salesman which America was selling, or the capitalist marketers of America were selling so fervently, that even an unprofessional salesman, and therefore implying that his economic and financial conditions are not that well off. So an unsuccessful salesman still continues with the profession because of the romance behind the idea of the traveling salesman, which became one of the representative poster professions for the country of America. Okay, so the importance of the traveling salesman in a country as scattered in its population as America is underscored by Coca-Cola's director of sales, who told his bottlers and salesmen that Coke could be sold from all kinds of outlets and the consumer must find it impossible to escape cola. Isn't that what we are still witnessing today? It is impossible for us not to see a bottle of Coca-Cola in a shop. And he says, gentlemen, I am quoting this, gentlemen, there is no place within reach by steps, elevator, ladder or derrick where Coca-Cola can be sold. But what should be reached by a Coca-Cola salesman, or that salesman should be fired. Salesmen should keep calling unremittingly on their prospects. No matter how many times you have talked to the dealer about Coke, there is always something new to say. Repetition convinces a man. A merchant buys so many different things that a persistent salesman wins an opening where a casual order taker makes no impression. Aggressive marketing through a combination of salesmanship, advertisement and distribution made Coca-Cola, and in lesser terms Pepsi, the signature drink for America. Unwittingly, it also became the other face of the Prohibition story. So where the government or power prohibited alcohol, claiming that this was the substance that caused increased prostitution, increased abortion, which is a sin according to conservative Catholicism. Does not matter if you have 12 to 13 children, if you are aborting, it's a sin. So when power or the government decides to ban this substance which is causing the sin of abortion, which is causing an upheaval of the sentiments of anti-Catholicism, reforms relating to anti-slavery, moral reforms, prostitution. So this substance is banned, and in comes another substitute which has sugar. Sucrose is also an addictive substance which has sugar, which causes severe health issues, and Coca-Cola was to go into a hell lot of legal miseries. It was to face a hell lot of legal suits and cases that were filed against it. And let me not even talk about India, because in our country we do not get the kind of Coca-Cola that Americans drink. There is a hell and heaven difference between the cola that they drink and the cola that we drink. So India is the dumping ground, be it coffee or Coca-Cola. Anything that is imported or so-called imported is not, we do not have it the same way that the people in that importing or that exporting country have it. So in comes this substitute, creating or generating huge revenues, and creating this ideology of the salesman. The salesman with white but slowly turning into yellow because of being under the sun for so long, with that shirt, with the tie hanging on his neck like a noose, almost the entire day, goes door to door and has to convince each and every person with a shop, no matter where that shop is. It can be under the stairs, it can be behind the door, it can be through a window. The salesman has to sell. So this obsession, this vigorous advertising campaigns, it began with this drink. The kind of advertisements, the kind of pursuing salesmanship that we saw, that we have also witnessed, it began with America. America basically gave birth to capitalism, to modern capitalism, to the how should I put it, the blood-sucking capitalism that we know of today. America gave birth to that. Then we have the next phenomenon, the next historical phenomenon or event or incident that takes place, that comes into the scene. The Great Depression. And the New Deal. So, while all these changes were taking place, the stock market crashed in 1929, sparking off a period of economic turmoil and turbulence and hardship that is known as the Great Depression, and that only ended after the US entered the Second World War, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, on the American fleet in the Pearl Harbor on 1941. There is a movie on this. It's a beautiful movie. Watch it. The Pearl Harbor. There is no "the" in the movie's name. Pearl Harbor. So that is how America entered the Second World War. The depression of the 1930s was not just an American but a European phenomenon. It brought widespread social unrest, and in Europe, several dictatorships came into existence. Among the most infamous of these, we know the names. Among the most infamous of these dictators were Francisco Franco in Spain. You can write their names down. The dictator of Spain, Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, of course, Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Germany. The Second World War actually came about as a result of Hitler's program to strengthen Germany when he attacked Austria, and he wanted to conquer other parts of Europe. The Depression years in America saw millionaire bankers and stockbrokers commit suicide, and the ordinary people lose their jobs and savings. The effect on farmers and on rural America was equally devastating, compounded by added on or made cumulative efforts made by the drought that happened happened in America, that America witnessed. The economic depression transformed agricultural land into what came to be known as the Dust Bowl. Infertile land, that is. Ecological historians note that 3 decades, that is 30 years of monocultures of wheat and corn, depleted the prairie grasslands of fertility, eroded the topsoil, and evaded the rainfall limits imposed by nature on the region. The early 1900s saw tremendous wheat yields, with millions of acres being harvested in the 8 Great Plains states. But when the market crashed, bringing about the depression, these crops had no takers at all. There were no buyers, and they were left standing in the fields. And so we have representations in literature in Grapes of Wrath. Written by John Steinbeck, which tells the story of the Dust Bowl refugees through the experiences of the Joad family, Joad, J-O-A-D, Joad family, who leave their land in Oklahoma and drive westward to California. This is the period when the worker, with all his disadvantages, the systems that oppress and exploit him, and his resistance to these, all of these factors, they find expression in literature. Steinbeck's novel catches the spirit of resistance in the young hero, Tom Joad, who teams up with Jim Casey, a minister who becomes a labor leader, in a fight against the exploitation of laborers. The novel became the bestseller, but was banned in various places such as California and Bakersfield, the setting of a part of the book, and in Kansas City, Missouri, and Buffalo, New York, and burned in St. Louis. Its dark picture of rural life in these years was variously denounced, disagreed to by politicians and rich farmers, and they were calling it a lie, a black, infernal creation of a twisted mind. Now, this is quoted in the essay called No Way Like the American Way. It's written by Erica Doss. So, rich farmers and the politicians, they disagreed to the representation in John Steinbeck's book. They disagreed that the condition of the workers were in actuality so deplorable and such pathetic, and they called it a lie, a black infernal creation of a twisted mind, therefore not recognizing the voice of the other person who is not in power, the other person who is not that powerful self who decides the truth, who thinks that there is only one truth with a capital T. However, the other voices, they have their truths to tell as well. And like all literature should, this book also represents that other voice, and with much fervor, with much honesty, with so much truth that it was rejected, and even burned in certain parts of America. So that itself, throws a light upon the significance of this book. The depression and its attendant economic and social changes, the poverty and bleakness of these years, and the process of slow recovery are all represented in literature. If fiction seems to be the most spacious form for its depiction, poets too responded to and documented these times. Among these were I will just quote from one particular poem by Alfred Hayes in his poem called In a Coffee Pot. It was published in the magazine called the Partisan Review in 1934. So he was among the writers representing the fate of the farm family, the poor farm family. Alfred Hayes, who used the figure of a young man who seems to have nothing to do but sit in the same place and drink coffee every night, to evoke a bleak picture of the effects of the depression in a coffee pot. So that is the theme behind the poem. And I'm quoting a few lines. Tonight, like every night, you see me here, drinking my coffee slowly, absorbed, alone, a quiet creature at the table in the rear, familiar at this evening hour and quite unknown. So the bleak image that forms a meta-narrative over here, the bleak image that this farm person who drinks coffee sees in front of him, that here you see me again. So that is all his life right now, and that entire image in turn presented to the readers, representing the bleak pathos and the dark days that characterized the Great Depression. We also have that another very famous work called the Glass Menagerie. You will read this when you go to higher studies. So the Glass Menagerie came out in a few years, that is 1945, written by Tennessee Williams. This book uses the depression as a backdrop of the play, The Glass Menagerie, which also shows the psychological scarring, the psychological trauma that it left behind. While another one of Arthur Miller's work called The American Clock, it historically represented the effects of the Great Depression, and gives a wider sense of its effects and sees it in retrospect as an experience that finally strengthened America. It's a much more positive view of the Depression. The recovery from this period of the Depression began with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt to the presidency and the inauguration of the New Deal through a series of acts that were aimed to stabilize prices, provide unemployment pay, and ensure old age support. Among the many new social safeguards were jobs that were created in the public sector. The New Deal had its place in the recovery of the country from the Depression, though the real turnaround comes with the multiple economic effects of the Second World War. The next phenomena we will talk about is one of the very important ones, that is, however, we will brief it over. Modernism. The shadow of the years of the Great Depression is evident in the darkness of its literature. The apocalyptic mood, the representation of working class life, the politicization of art, and in nostalgia for the stabilities of the past. Predictably, this is the period of intellectual revolution, as diverse influences came together to produce modernist literature with its formal and thematic innovations. its representations of the psychological crisis, and its doubts about the future of the human race. The way modernist literature used a collage of sources from myth and tradition in a writer's own culture and drew on other cultures, including the great European cultural traditions, and for many, the cultures of the East, such as Ezra Pound, who wrote about China, Japan, and Eliot, who was influenced by Indian religion. All this, they represent a measure not only of the intellectual revolution and the turmoil of these years, but specifically of the internalization of American life as people adjusted and accepted the American life while nostalgically retrospecting about the past, while thinking about the things that they have lost, but while being in a state of transition, they are internalizing the idea of America with the expatriate writer, that is a person who is living outside of America, outside of one's country, is known as an expatriate. So with the expatriate writer now becoming an important and representative figure in modernist literature. So modernism in America is realized in a new awareness of the need to make formal and structural innovations to match the changes in perception, the changing world, the change of lifestyle, and the questioning of tradition in social, political, and cultural institutions. And so we have Henry Adams, one of the observers of the time, who referred to a law of the new multiverse in his book The Education of Henry Adams. This is the name of the book. And he's writing and he's noting the equal possibilities of great development and great regression. So both are possible. And he says, I'm quoting, the perpetual effort of society to establish law and the perpetual revolt of society against the law it had established, the perpetual building up of the authority by force and the perpetual appeal of force to overthrow it, the perpetual symbolism of a higher law and the perpetual relapse to a lower one, the perpetual victory of the principles of freedom and their perpetual conversion into principles of power. Very well put. So socially, these were the changes in the modes of living, in the institutions of family and marriage, in race relationships, and in the status and conditions of African Americans, Native Americans, the new immigrants, the growing urbanism, and in the mobility of people brought about by automobile revolutions. Some of these are also, however, issues of space. For example, the urban development and the transformation of the land by crisscrossing railroads, roads and highways, the buildings of great dams, and the changing of the small town into the city. So theses and antitheses, a force coming up and counter forces coming up, cultures forming, counter cultures forming, subversive cultures forming, power forming itself, resistance also forming itself. When the small town of the past gave way to the city all over the country, there were social as well as spatial changes. Obviously, there will be. The residents of these new cities now had access to banks, department stores, hospitals, factories, warehouses, the cinema, and civic amenities like piped water supply, paved streets, and public transport. All of these were available now to the man in the city, to the men, to the people living in the city. These multiple transformations occurred in both material culture, that is, they could be seen in towns and cities and the cityscapes, and also non-material cultures, like they could be seen in the changing beliefs, customs, and the institutional laws that people would follow. Next comes the other very important historical phenomenon. The Second World War, or World War II, which came in the backdrop of the Depression. The economic and social effects of the war were consolidated and change continued. This time, too, the most important area where change occurred was the industry, which was now revolutionized by the need to manufacture armaments and other goods for America's participation in the war. Women again found employment, and blacks were called upon as soldiers and officers. And the external danger unified the country. It unified the country. The war ended in 1945 with the surrender of Germany and the US bombing of the Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we all know that, which led to the surrender of Japan. European countries lost their preeminence, lost its colonies in this effort, and America stepped on to the world stage as the richest and the most powerful nation. America's participation in the war began on a small scale, but her position among world powers was enhanced considerably. When Harry Truman was the president, he directed the war effort of the Congressional Committee and became president of the country after the death of Roosevelt. By this time, a new element had entered the war. And what was that? The use of bombers to drop bombs on cities. Begun by Hitler's Germany, many European cities were attacked indiscriminately from the air, and in response, Winston Churchill initiated the mass bombing of German cities on 1940. That is the Prime Minister of Britain. The Americans joined in with their heavy B-25 bombers, bombing Japanese cities. The US Army Air Corps bombers operated in conjunction with the British Royal Air Force in carrying out continual raids, often 1,000 bombers or more each, on German targets. The attack on Dresden is a representative. So you can learn about this history. So maybe you can go to this site called history.com and learn about this attack on Dresden, which is one of the most controversial air attacks that America carried out, however in alliance with British forces. So there were almost 800 bombers who attacked, ravaged the city with the air bombing. Kurt Vonnegut, a writer called Kurt Vonnegut, writes about it. I just wrote what I said. Writes about it in his book called Slaughterhouse-Five. And he says about the city of Dresden, the city was just gone. Hmm? A huge number of bombs and incendiaries were dropped, causing a firestorm that destroyed 4,500 acres and 25,000 men, women, children were killed. The next major target after Germany was Japan, and America marshaled its air and naval fleets in this effort. It bombed Japanese cities in an effort to make Japan surrender, and Japan's refusal to do so was a way to explain the systematic destruction that followed. Bombs were dropped on 36 Japanese towns and cities in civilian areas, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Before the dropping of the atomic bombs, the conventional bombing itself had destroyed about more than 20 lakhs of buildings, made 9 million homeless, killed 26 like 2,60,000 and injured more than 40 lakhs of people. This happened in the period between the last November 1944 to 1945. The draft, which is a compulsory enlisting into the army, forced many young men into the forces, unprepared for the horrors they would see and the hovering death. The bombardier, that is the use of bombers, becomes one of the typical figures of the literature of the time. And you can read this novel, you can read this Slaughterhouse-Five as well. It forms another novel called Joseph Heller, writing Catch 22. Both of these are something that we call anti-war novels. So the bombardier is represented with dark humor by Joseph Heller in the figure of his hero called Yossarian in the novel Catch 22. Yossarian is strapped into the B-25 bomber, which is otherwise stable, dependable, but it is very tight, that is there is very narrow leg space. It is narrow, square and cold tunnel, separating the bombardier's compartment in the plexiglass nose from the nearest escape hatch. And the image of the screaming aircraft again is something that we see at the beginning of the novel written by Thomas Pynchon, Gravity's Rainbow. This is all of these novels are very very good. I have read them all, so you can go ahead and read at least Catch 22, Gravity's Rainbow. War indeed is the major theme in America's national life in the 20th century, with several engagements in different parts of the world, creating a recurrent demand for the American soldier to fight overseas. War is therefore one of the most important themes in literature of this century, as I gave you a few examples. And this particular backdrop is very important in order to understand about the one of the representative American writers, that is Ernest Hemingway. Himself was rejected by the army on the grounds of faulty vision, and joined the Red Cross as an ambulance driver. He went on into active duty in Italy in 1918 and left the war with many wounds and an Italian decoration. He began a career in journalism with the Kansas City Star in 1917 and returned to the profession after the war as a reporter for the Toronto Star. The journalistic style of reporting concrete facts is an important aspect of lessons in writing that also included the influence of other people like Sherwood Anderson and then Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein being the person who was the first one to call Hemingway one of the lost generation. To which Fitzgerald also belonged. Uh, a term which forms the epigraph of one of Hemingway's works called The Sun Also Rises, a novel about heavily drinking expatriates who are literally the lost generation. So, what is interesting in Hemingway's works, being a war hero that he himself was, it is interesting to note how the spirit of skepticism about the glory of war that Hemingway expressed in all his works came to influence later writers like the ones written on the right hand side, who were writing anti-war novels. So there was a deep sense of speculation, behind the love of glory for the war, behind the love for the greater purpose that the war stands for. There is an inherent skepticism in the tone of writing. Many of the young men that Hemingway writes of fight on foreign soil, affirming their code of life of sensual pleasures, a life lived in the moment, expressing sheer physicality, living and drinking hard, and at the end finding solace in the moments of being with oneself. The war itself is viewed with suspicion, and I'm quoting from one of the characters of one of Ernest Hemingway's works called A Farewell to Arms. So, a character called Frederick Henry says, I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice, and the expression in vain. We had heard them, sometimes standing in the rain, almost out of earshot, so that only the shouted words came through, and had read them on proclamations that were slapped up by bill posters over other proclamations. And I had seen nothing sacred, and the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like the stockyards at Chicago. So the glorification of war, which served the purpose of underscoring the glorious purpose of fighting for one's country, it also implied a certain kind of suspicion for war, because the Americans who were fighting outside of their space in other fronts, other geographical fronts, fighting for a purpose with which they had no immediate touch with. Many of those who were to return from war were to face no changes whatsoever in their daily livelihoods. So, a sense of loss, even though you are fighting for your country, this sense of detachment, it ended in the characters or the so-called war heroes in these literary works. It ended with them finding solace with themselves, only themselves, and nothing else, nobody else. Now let's come to learn about the effects of all that we just discussed upon the effects on the society. That is, just a moment. The effect on people. Is the spelling right? Yes, the spelling is right. People and spaces. So, among the visible effects of the world wars are cities that started swelling, that started growing out of proportion with the arrival of new immigrants from the southern and eastern Europe on the east coast and from Asia along the west coast. early writers wrote of New York and other cities. Writers in this period record their experience of the cities and demonstrate the way the urbanization lends flavor to literature. The city, with its population, its congestion, and the crime, was represented also in popular genres such as detective fiction. Other reasons for the increase in the size of population of cities were the influx of blacks as a result of the Great Migration. I think I have mentioned this as well. Great Migration from the south that began in the 1890s and by about 1960s, that is within a century, about 6 million blacks had arrived in the northern cities, and the rise in employment opportunities in city offices of industrial companies, factories, and professions like journalism, they also saw themselves rising. The First World War drew many well-paid wartime jobs, drew many to these well-paid wartime jobs. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis were the popular destinations. The sudden arrival of such large numbers put pressure on housing and other civic amenities, even as it strained cultural and social relations. But nobody stopped the immigration because the manpower was required to fight the war. And once the war was fought and won over twice, the men of the power were made powerless again. That is what happens. In the cycle of life, mostly. One result of this immigration was the rise of the ghetto. As residential neighborhood for all races, but especially the blacks, as boundaries between black and white areas were clearly demarcated. Harlem is the most famous instance. Originally a Dutch village, until about 1910 residents were of British, Irish, German and Jewish origin. It had quiet, neat street lined with brownstone houses and restaurants and shops and theatres. Its decline began with a sudden spurt in housing meant for whites who did not turn up. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the first black realty speculator, Philip A. Payton Jr., founder of the Afro-American Realty Company, helped middle-class black families to move into the area, and he named several buildings after famous black figures. The whites resisted, but many white landlords found in this an opportunity to make quick profits, selling houses to blacks at up to 75% above the rates offered to whites. Blacks continued to arrive and settle while whites began to move out. By the end of the 1920s, Harlem had degenerated into a slum that attracted immigrants from Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. By 1925, it had a population density of 330 to the acre. In black districts, disease and riots were common features. It also became hospitable ground for herb doctor, faith healers, African medicine men, spiritualists, palmists, magicians and others such who had ready solutions to many problems, because there were no material, concrete and subsidized solutions to the real problems which these people were facing. So substitutes came into the place, faith healers, herb doctors, that is doctors who would prescribe you marijuana for several of diseases, which is absolutely false. It does not happen like that. So since there were no real material solutions available, Nobody would give them, they cannot afford it, the vicious cycle of poverty again. So they were left with these, these so-called healers. uh, on sale were blessed handkerchiefs, potent powders, love charms and amulets. Amulets মানে পায়ের নূপুর পরা আর কি. Above all, there were churches, mostly storefront, in front of the stores, but several among the most magnificent in New York City. So, city life, affected by crime and wealth, shows interesting developments. There is change in lifestyle and in the look of city, with wealth finding new ways of expanding itself. So, if urbanization, with urbanization, with the influx of labor power, with growth of industries, and with the accumulation of more wealth among the already wealthy, so now they needed several other ways in order to expand, in order to use that wealth. And one of the best representations of how this wealth was used you can find in the movie called Citizen Kane, which came out in 1941. Newspaper baron, he was a newspaper baron portrayed in this film. The newspaper baron called William Randolph Hearst, who ran campaigns in his several newspapers against prostitution and saloons and dance halls, and is believed to have been responsible in some measure for cleaning up San Francisco. So Hearst spent his immense wealth in some of the most striking construction projects ever. That is the way he spent his money, and therefore giving rise to new forms of architecture, which is obviously one of the pillars of any cultures that we talk about. Architecture is one of the representative pillars of any of the several cultures that there are in this world. So any different culture you step into, you will find architecture representing it aptly and in the most optimum fashion. So this person who was building, trying to spend the money on new architecturally designed buildings, had the structure of the architecture had a central building with 127 rooms, a swimming pool outside, 3 guest buildings with 187 rooms, and 2 libraries. The guest building had a total of 47 bathrooms. And so that was how it was made. So that is how big it was. The growth of tourism, the obsession with buildings begins in the 19th century, when the immense fortunes being made from oil, automobile and other industries manifested in the concrete realities of palatial houses like palaces, together with the growth of tourism, led to the construction of opulent hotels. Hotel businesses flourished that boasted of many bathrooms in an expression of the overall interest in plumbing, drainage and clean water. The city also became the ground for crime and saw the rise of the mafia, especially the Italian mafia, with links to the mafia in Italy or Sicily, and names like that of Al Capone becoming legendary. So we all know of Mario Puzo's The Godfather. If you have not read this or seen this, I insist that you do watch the movie. You watch the 3 parts of The Godfather. Do it. It's imperative that you watch this movie, which is about, The Godfather is about the Corleone family and its empire of crime, and it became a cult movie. It is still one of the most popular movies ever made. It was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. So one historian, that is one historian social critic, Carrie, sorry, McWilliams writes of Los Angeles between the years 1900 to 1920s, and I'm quoting, Los Angeles was essentially a tourist town. Like most tourist towns, it had its share of freaks, sideshows, novelties, and showplaces. Ducks waddled along the street with advertisements painted on their backs. 6'9" pituitary giants with sandwich board signs stalked the downtown streets, while thousands of people carrying Bibles in their hands and singing hymns marched in evangelical parades. That is what you would be seeing in Los Angeles if you were to visit that. If you were to travel through time into past and visit that in the 1920s, you would see cities stacked with advertisements, with people becoming advertisements, and on the same time the city of lost angels, so the city of angels, sees several people walking with Bible in evangelical parades. The Hollywood star, so this was also the time when Hollywood came to be. California citizens tried to have movie making banned within city limits, but once begun, this was one industry that took over Hollywood. Universal City, the first of the great Hollywood structures erected for movie sets, was built in 1915, inaugurating the era of the Jewish movie tycoons, Samuel Goldwyn and Louis B. Mayer. So Metro Goldwyn Mayer, along with Marcus Liu, Metro Goldwyn Mayer. William Fox, giving rise to the 20th Century Fox. The Warner Brothers, giving rise to the production house of the Warner Brothers. So they are still there, they are still here, they are still the representative production houses of Hollywood, and they have shifted their interests to other region, to Bollywood as well, to other movies, to other film industries as well. So the Hollywood star was the product of this unique industry that also spawned a lavish lifestyle. Endless parties and magnificent houses in styles derived from all over the world, but also replicating structures from children's storybooks that influence other structures like libraries, restaurants, shops, and office buildings. The stars who lived in these magnificent, if strange, palaces saw them as settings that sustained their mystique, helping them to live out lives that were as unreal as their movie roles. So the Hollywood stars, they carried out their star persona into their personal lives as well, thus blurring the lines between the actor on the screen and the star in real life. Hollywood gave rise to material excesses. Cocktails, alcohols, drugs, suicides, divorce, sexual relationship alarmed the industry enough for it to put in a code of conduct for stars and set of directions for what could be depicted on screen. So there we come across the censor board, the various kinds of censorships that would be followed and cohered and adhered to through the process of movie making. At the same time, so I'll just talk a bit about these codes and censorships that came into place. The Hays Code came into place, which ensured that there were model clauses in the contracts of stars, what was permissible on screen and what was not, kisses lasting more than 7 feet of film, clergy in comic or villain roles, the explicit, attractive or justified treatment of adultery, nudity under any circumstances, sympathy for murder, safecracking, arson, smuggling, all low, disgusting, unpleasant, though not necessarily evil subjects. These were all banned. The Hays Code, enhanced with greater details, became the Production Code and was in place from 1930 to 66. Now this code is no longer in operation. The code represents immediate concerns of the time as well. Just the concerns that I just mentioned, which were mentioned by the Hays Code, were also the concerns which gave rise to prohibition. Longer version of it shows the different points of these time. These included strictures against drugs, trafficking, mercy killing, etc., as these affected public life or were the subjects of debate. Hollywood attracted writers and artists in droves. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a number of tales based on the experiences of a Hollywood script writer. In his work called The Pat Hobby Stories, came out in 1962, drawing on his own unsuccessful attempts to become a script writer. The city also provided rich material and location for crime novels such as The Black Dahlia, The Big Nowhere, LA Confidential, White Jazz, all written by James Ellroy. And with all of these, businesses increased, work increased, there was a rise in the demand for labor. Working conditions, they degenerated. There were objections against the working hours, the poor working conditions in which the laborers had to work, and as a result, the number of strikes among the laborers against the companies, against the industries, they also grew. As the number of strikes grew, labor unions were formed. Various labor unions were formed. The society changed. There were newer educational and employment reforms. Gender differences came to be represented in the change of fashion, in the change of revolution. Dresses were revolutionized, relationships and sexualities, including gay, lesbian visibility, was seen in America at this point of time. The print media, the newspaper industry became powerful and an independent instrument and saw the rise of investigative journalism, which also gave rise to a counterculture called gonzo journalism. You can do a quick Wikipedia study about this, what this gonzo journalism is about. Mobility increased, which did not only include cars and innovations in transportations. There were mobility of people, as we saw in the Great Migration, mobility of ideas, mobilities of fashion, and many people, many traveled to Europe, abroad to Europe, when while they were struggling against the inequalities of the society and fighting for rights of the workers. African Americans moved out of the segregated South, which was known as the Great Migration in cities. Huge cultural and eventually socio-political upheavals resulted from the African American presence in New York, as we know, from the Harlem Renaissance in literature, which we have studied together. There were several fights for freedom and visibility and a growing awareness about the rights of women and African Americans. The automobile industry grew from the efforts of one man, that is Henry Ford. To a quick read about Fordism as well. He built the first gasoline engine in 1892 and in 1902 founded the Ford Motor Company. The Ford's Model T was on the roads fueled by cheap oil from Standard Oil, reasonably priced, safe and durable vehicle that was easily available to the and accessible to the American people. Ford is responsible for the innovation in production that we are now familiar with the assembly line and that spread rapidly to other industries around the world. It was the culmination of decades of labor saving devices, new management ideas, improvements in metal alloys, increasing precision in machine tools, and experimentations with production. It made work easier. There were transcontinental railroads that were being built. America was transforming. It was becoming the face of and for development, with the CocaCola, with Hollywood, with T. Ford, with McDonald's, all of which added to the glory of America. There were external concerns as well. Following the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union came to be presented as the new bogey, as the new villain. There was the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, the phrase Iron Curtain was used by the British Parliament to describe the shrouding, the covering of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. Many of these issues made their appearance in the popular culture of these times. Films like Red Menace made their appearance in these years, which made representing all the fears of a society now suddenly exposed to dangers from outside its borders, especially the fear of communism. So this was also the era of McCarthyism, in which communists were hunted down, like witches were hunted down in the medieval ages. Communists were hunted down, hanged, burned, killed, jailed, imprisoned, in the face of the society, right? In the face of society, there was nothing hidden. And with this, I would like to end this part of American history. This will be followed by another part as we move on more to the racial issues in context.